Hi, welcome to Substack Weekend Review Unscripted Podcast number 6. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this video, or this audio file. All right, so this week we're going to talk about the three articles I wrote on Substack this week. The first one is the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve football. The next is why the Russian economy is still growing, and the nuclear arms race in the Baltic. So this week we'll start with the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve football. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve for the United States, also called the SPR, was created after the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and a combined army in the Middle East that was predominantly led by Egypt and Syria. The U.S. was a supporter of Israel during the war, and the war led to the OPEC oil embargoes of 1973 and 1974, which famously led to the gas lines in the U.S. and spiking gas prices. And the sad thing is, I was a kid then, and I remember this happening. I remember the amazing fact of seeing gas go to $1 a gallon. I just thought that was amazing growing up. And we had this old Chevy station wagon, gas guzzler, and I just remember my dad being very upset or angry, I would say more, about the impact of having to pay so much for gas. Don't remember the gas lines as much, but I do remember the spiking oil prices. So that's just a personal aside. The OPEC exposed the vulnerability of the U.S. economy for cheap oil and being vulnerable to oil shocks caused by the embargo. What you run into is that during that time, U.S. was wanting cheap oil. So what it was doing was it was doing less domestic production, which was more expensive, and was buying more Middle East oil. And at the same time, the U.S. demand for oil was increasing. So it was if you had to sit there, it was a perfect execution by OPEC on an economy that had become so reliant on oil from the Middle East. The SPR was created after this war and the oil embargoes, and like all things in Washington, D.C., it was moved from its original purpose to another tool to be wielded by the political whims of our leaders in Washington, D.C. So the SPR goal, again, Strategic Petroleum Reserve, was created with the intent to give the U.S. a stockpile of oil that can be used in case of a national emergency like a war or a natural disaster that disrupts U.S. supplies. For example, an example would be Hurricane Katrina and some of the other hurricanes that happened that year that went through the Gulf. They had to shut down the Gulf oil platforms, and then also the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S., in the southeastern U.S. that goes all the way up to New England. Basically, I think it runs from Louisiana all the way through the U.S. southeast, all the way up to the New England states, was shut down because of the flooding in the pumps. And basically, it shut down the oil pipeline from the refineries on the Gulf Coast. That's an example of a natural disaster. It could also be used for international issues, like a wider war that's outside of just the U.S. that disrupts the world oil supply, or any other type of national or international issue like the Ukraine war. We'll kind of go into that in a moment. But so this could be used when something happens like such as closing the shipping waterways of the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, and that's where almost all the Middle East oil comes from. Some of it's pipelined to other locations, but for the most part, it runs through the Persian Gulf on the Strait of Hormuz, which is just north of Iran, and it's subject to closure. So that would be an area that would be a case where you'd want to release Strategic Petroleum Reserve to balance out the price shocks and the supply disruptions. Another one would be like the Iranian attacks through proxies in Yemen on the Saudi Arabian oil fields. Saudi Arabia is basically the swing oil producer in the world. It has a lot of excess capacity, so it can increase its oil supply. Those attacks obviously caused a disruption in the world oil supply. The other one is the war in Ukraine disrupting the flow of oils due to sanctions. So the Strategic Petroleum Reserve gives leaders the ability to use sanctions and be able to compensate for the oil shock when they impose sanctions on energy producers like Russia. Go into that a little bit more. So the U.S. is also part of what's called the International Energy Agency, or IEA, and this energy agency has a strategy to have member countries maintain a minimum supply equivalent to 90 days of average imports, not average usage, average imports. There's 37 member countries, so these countries also have strategic petroleum reserves as well, along with the U.S. The U.S. is the largest has the largest strategic petroleum reserve, but there again, there's 37 countries, including the United States. Members sell the oil in the international market to soften impacts to international disruptions. Just like us, these members can also use that oil reserves to soften impacts to domestic disruptions, again, weather events, or let's say strikes. A lot of you see unionization in other countries that maybe the oil workers or the refinery workers strike. So that's a case where there could be use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This system works is because oil is a fungible product. That means that it doesn't matter if it's U.S. oil, Saudi Arabia oil, Russian oil, Mexican oil. If it's sold, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's issues you can go into refining and all that, but oil is a fungible product. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It's the idea is everybody puts oil into the market, and it doesn't matter where it comes from. So as long as the market pipeline, not a oil pipeline, but the market pipeline remains close to full. So it doesn't matter. So if Saudi Arabian oil drops for some reason, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve from all these 37 countries can be added into the market to fuel up, to create, to make up for that shortfall. And the idea is that it's keeping that pipeline full so that the shocks and disruptions caused by natural disasters or wars are mitigated. So it doesn't work completely perfectly, because obviously when you go into some type of supply disruption for whatever cause, it's not as efficient as the current process. So like if the Middle East oil is used to set up to come through tankers through the Strait of Hormuz up through into Asia, to Japan, China, yes, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve can make up for that. So for example, they could release oil, the US could release oil into the market, and producers in Japan could buy that oil, that Strategic Petroleum Reserve oil, and it's, instead of coming from the Strait of Hormuz, maybe it's coming from California or Alaska. In this case, most likely it's coming from the Gulf down through to back through Asia. So the idea is it's oil to basically fill the pipeline of the market. But it's inefficient because, again, you're used to pulling oil from in this case, the Middle East. Now it has to come from a different direction. There obviously is some form of disruption in the distribution. The other fact is usually when there's a disruption to oil for whatever reason, that causes oil futures to rise. So because there's an uncertainty in the market due to the disruption, which makes the price of oil go up. So even though they can release Strategic Petroleum Reserve oil, it's not coming in the most efficient distribution center at the point that the crisis occurs, and it's also dealing with a higher oil futures, which also increases the price of oil. And the other part is the SPRs, for the most part, are not going to release enough oil to make up, for example, a disruption of Saudi Arabian oil. So it's, even though it's trying to keep the price from spiraling out of control, it can only make up so much. So in that case, it will be less oil than the loss of, for example, Saudi Arabian oil. but the SPR from the 37 countries can at least mitigate the spike somewhat, and also add some confidence in the market that the economies are not going to ground to a halt because there's oil being released into the market. So in this case, like the US SPR can be sold domestically to make up for example, Saudi Arabian oil becoming offline. Or it can be sold to other countries, let's say in Europe, that will need the oil, so we would sell some of our oil to to Europe to compensate for the loss of, or for the disruption in oil. Most likely happens though is not always, but usually the U.S. sells its own oil domestically, and it just imports less, and what the U.S. would normally import gets redirected to other countries. There's always variations to this. It's not a perfect. Hey, this is exactly how it happens. The oil markets are a maze, and I'm not a professional on it, but I've seen enough on the oil markets, the spot markets, that it's amazing that we move oil as efficiently as we do in the world. So, okay, so we'll go into the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The U.S. has the authority that comes from Congress to store up to 714 million barrels of oil currently. That can change from time to time through an act of Congress because that oil has to be purchased. And of course, the purchasing power comes from Congress. The SPR, this is interesting, is the SPR is primarily stored in underground salt caverns in geologically stable locations along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. So there's not just big, usually when they show pictures of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, they're showing all these fields of oil tanks, and they're talking about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Well, most of the oil for the SPR is sitting underground. So I thought that was an interesting fact. I knew that prior, but I just thought it was interesting. So the other part is, remember the idea with the IEA is to have 90 days equivalent of average oil imports available in your SPR. The U.S. right now currently imports an average of 8.5 million barrels a day and uses 20 million barrels a day. That means that we use 11.5 million of domestic oil, 8.5 million of imported oil. So the measure, that 90-day supply, is based on the 8.5 million barrels of oil a day. Of course, that fluctuates. We can create more domestic production and lower that average import rate. So the IEA wants 90 days of minimum average of oil imports a day, not oil consumption. But the U.S. authorization at the current use of imported oil is only 84 days of authorized average imports. So the 714 million barrels right now is only 84 days. So it's close to the 90 days. And probably what you see is that in the U.S. that more domestic production or a slowdown in the economy would actually push that 714 million barrels to 90 plus days. So that's the authorization. Remember that number, 714 million barrels is what's enacted by Congress in the SPR. So, as I said, Congress can set this level from time to time. There was a period where the U.S. they were holding in 2010, they had 727 million barrels of oil, which is higher than the authorization amount, but it was the authorization amount at the time. So what the U.S. did as part of call it a budget gimmick, was it sold off part of the strategic oil reserve to pay bills in the U.S. budget. So it was used as a tool to balance out the budget. Remember when I talked earlier in the very first part where they're using the oil reserve for something other than what it was intended, which was to address disruptions in the oil market that it's either caused by domestic or international issues. We sold off part of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to pay bills. Okay, we're in debt, I get that, but maybe cut spending. Just a thought. Just a thought. So in 2021, when President Biden took office, there were 638 million barrels of oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve on 714 million barrels target. So we were well below the target. Part of it was COVID and some of the disruptions from COVID. Also, when COVID hit, there was attempts to buy more oil at the very cheap rate, because where I talked about uncertainty causes oil futures to rise, COVID lockdowns caused economic activity to drop in the economies, which made the oil futures drop. And at one point, I think they were actually on some of the markets, oil was actually worth less, was actually worth a negative dollar amount. So there was an attempt at the end of President Trump's administration to start buying up more oil. He did receive some pushback in Congress. But anyway, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was authorized to be 714. It was 638 when Biden took office. Now, by the end of 2021, which, remember, this is before the Ukraine war, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was down to $594 million, or down 10%. The Biden administration, before Congress stated the Biden administration went before Congress and stated the drawdown of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was due to the Ukraine war and its sanctions. But the drawdown here, it started before the war. So we were already down 10% before the war even started. In January 2021, so this is going to the phase where they're saying, well, the Russian war caused inflation. Now I'm going to go over some numbers to show no. It did cause some price rises, but what caused European inflation and what caused U.S. inflation is two different things. So I'm going to sit there and throw a lot of numbers at you. So January 2021, the time that President Biden took office, U.S. inflation was at 1.7%. Now, chances are it was probably going to rise above the 3% mark, just because looking at some of the numbers of the deficit spending due to COVID, there was going to be some stimulation in the economy with no new, so inflation was going to rise. If I remember right, it was going to be like they predicted it was going to be above the 2% mark at something like 2.7 or 2.8, but I'm going by memory there. But it was going to be slightly above the Fed's 2% target rate. Okay. Biden takes office January 2021. U.S. inflation is at 1.7%. By the end of 2021, U.S. inflation was up to 7%. And remember when I talked about that there was different causes of inflation. The U.S. before the start of the Ukraine war, the U.S. inflation rate was 7.0% compared to the European Union of 2.9%. So in a year, the U.S. interest or inflation rate went up from 1.7 to 7.0. The European Union, I think it was started at 2 something and ended at 2.9 something. They were also having some suffering of stimulation where they had to stimulate due to COVID. All of this is before the Ukraine war started. They had already started selling off the petroleum reserve, and inflation was already a problem in the U.S., not the European Union, in the U.S. prior to the start of the Ukraine war. Now, the U.S. administration was selling off the SPR to mitigate inflation that was caused by overstimulating the economy and increasing the money supply due to the programs like the American Rescue Plan. So what they were doing was they were selling off more of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to keep gas prices down so that it would mitigate the impact of inflation across the economy. Again, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not meant to be used in this. There was no oil disruption in the U.S. There was no oil disruption in the world at the end of January 2021 and the beginning of 2022. There was no reason to sell off the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to hide what was going on in the U.S. economy. February 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Western sanctions of Russian oil disrupt the world oil supply. This is a legitimate use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, is that allows countries to use sanctions against energy producing countries and not risk their economies by doing it. So the SPR levels are encouraged to be released around the world. So not just the US, but those other 37 countries. So from February 2022 to the end of 2022, the SPR was reduced from 588 million to 372 million barrels. The market by the end of 2022 had adjusted to the oil shock, and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve did not have to be used anymore. The world kind of got used to the moving of oil. It kind of settled into a higher price. The shock was over. Yes, the high price of oil had risen. There's two things behind it, because we won't get into this, but we were in an inflationary environment, which makes the dollar worth less, but the US dollar, for the most part, is the international reserve currency, and it's what oil's sold in. So if your dollar is worth less because of inflation, that means the price of oil goes up, all things else being equal. So the oil shock was over by the end of 2022. Actually, it was over by pretty much by the end of winter 2022. So and then it kind of rose again coming into the winter 2023. But the oil shock was the economy had adjusted to this. So at the end of 2022, the U.S. inflation rate was at 6.5%. The European Union was 9.2%. Now, there was through 2022, we had spiked at, I think we got as high as 9. The EU got a little bit higher, but they ended 2022, us at 6.5%, and European Union at 9.2. So the inflation rate had slowed. I'm not going to say it's dropped, because it's just its rate of increase was slowing compared to 2021, which was 7. 2022, the rate of increase had slowed to 6.5. The European Union had sped from 2.9 to 9.2. So the reason why is that the U.S. is less susceptible to oil shocks when compared to Europe. So the U.S. inflation was primarily due to fiscal policy, and the EU was due to the impact of energy price. The European Union did not go through a stimulation pack. They did stimulate during COVID, but after we came out of COVID, they didn't do any more big stimulation packages like the U.S. did. So it was, and the U.S. is also more energy independent, is less susceptible to energy spikes than when compared to Europe. Remember, is the U.S. imports less than half of its oil need, and it can actually export a fair amount of oil to other countries as well, outside of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Maybe we're exporting oil that we think is more expensive to process into gasoline and diesel than importing Middle East oil. So there's other things going into the energy market as well. But the U.S. is more energy independent than the European Union. So our inflation was due to fiscal policy, overspending, overstimulating the economy, EU, due to energy prices. This shows that the reason for inflation in the U.S. and the EU were caused, for the most part, by two different issues. So when they come up and say, oh, the Ukraine war caused inflation, no, it did not. It became an easy, lazy answer coming from our leaders that was the reason for inflation. They did not want to admit that their overstimulation of the U.S. economy and deficit spending was a reason for inflation in the U.S. It was just a lazy answer. at best, dishonest lie at worst. So, the U.S. continued to sell oil. Remember what I said? The price shock had ended in 2022. The U.S. continued to sell oil through 2023 from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and it dropped to a low of 347 million barrels. It's authorized to be at 714. It started at the beginning of the Biden administration at 638, and it's reached a low of 347 million barrels. So, in late 2023, or the second half of 2023, the U.S. slowly started buying more oil to bring the Strategic Petroleum Reserve up. And the last reported numbers that I could see coming from the Department of Energy was the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in January 2024 was at 358 million barrels. So it had risen 11 million barrels with as of January 2024. But the U.S. government has just released that they have suspended, I say just released, about a month ago or so, within the last month, that they will suspend all replenishment purchases of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and they at the same time they canceled a large number of domestic oil leases are canceled. Remember to talk about oil futures, and you see that some regions in the country are seeing spikes in gas prices. Some of that's converting over to summer blends, but also there has been some disruption in the market, the futures for oil. The SPR in the U.S. is at the lowest point since 1983. So we're going there about the idea of abuses to the SPR. And I've talked about this briefly. The use of the SPR is to help with sanctions is a legitimate use of the SPR. It gives leaders a policy option to use against oil-producing, energy-producing nations if needed, such as an invasion of Ukraine. However, the administration was using the SPR not only for legitimate purposes, but to cover up inflationary impact of its policies. So since the administration, since taking office in January 2021, has reduced the SPR by 208 million barrels. Now, doing some rough math, because some of this kind of crosses into each other, but roughly in the time period of when you saw the decreases in the SPR due to the time period from February 2022 to the end of 2022, when you should have seen some changes in where you see stabilization in the market, 135 million barrels of oil were sold due to the Russian invasion impacts, basically to add oil into the markets due to the Russian invasion. 73 million was sold to soften domestic energy prices due to the economic policies resulting in the failures to get Saudi Arabia, which the administration called a pariah nation, Iran, despite giving billions of dollars in sanction relief, and Venezuela, who refused over ideology. See the Mexican sanctions, stating that sanctions need to be removed in Venezuela to secure a border on their side. So what was happening? They sold $73 million of SPR. They initially did not want to do that. They wanted to try to get Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela to start selling more oil and offering sanction relief if they would be willing to sell more oil. Saudi Arabia said, no, you called us a pariah nation, we're not selling. Iran said, no, we're not doing that either, even though we gave them billions of dollars of sanction relief. And Venezuela said no as well. So he had to start selling more of the SPR to start covering that $73 million he was using to soften domestic energy prices. So that $208 million or 208 million barrels that were sold off or reduced in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, 1/3 of it was being used for a purpose that it was never intended to be used for. This is the case where Washington has abused the intent of the SPR. So anyway, I can talk more and more about this one. It's very interesting to me. It's a combination of energy, oil, international market. There's so many things that touch into this market. Thought it was a fascinating subject. Read the paper. I might write more about this, especially if we see changes. I'm very curious to see what's going to happen in an election year, trying to keep oil prices down or energy prices down in the U.S., but at the same time, leases have been canceled. It will be interesting to see how energy is used in the U.S., whether they sell off more of the SPR to keep prices down, to improve electoral chances. Also, as an interesting side note, selling the SPR, the U.S. SPR on the international market is a legitimate action. Most of the time it's used domestically and then we don't import as much, but it is a legitimate action to do. So part of it was sold to China, and the interesting thing is that one of the companies that it was sold to, a Chinese company that was sold to, was one that Hunter Biden was a partner in, was a minority partner, but was a partner in. Is that legal, illegal? Is it unethical? Well, we'll just leave it at that. So anyway, and then the next paper of the week is, why is the Russian economy still growing? This actually also ties into the SPR issue, and about how Western sanctions were used. Unintended, but just the way it turned out. So we talk about the invasion of Ukraine led to Western sanctions against Russia, which were promised to be the harshest sanctions to be implemented in modern times. I think maybe you could argue that the blockade of Germany during World War I, World War II, especially during World War I, could be maybe argued to be more harsh, but this was the harshest ones in modern times. So the war is in its third year, and Russia actually appears stronger than ever, and it shows a willingness to keep the war going for the foreseeable future. So they feel no pressure to go and have peace talks. They are in an economic position that is actually growing, and the Russian economy is growing faster than the G7 countries in 2023. And these were the countries that led so hard in punishing Russia for the invasion. So the issue is that there's loopholes in the sanctions. We'll go through this. Is this the reason that Russia continues to grow and grow at a faster rate, both militarily and economically, than the G7 countries that implemented the sanctions and are supporting Ukraine militarily? And so, or has the West failed in their sanctions by leaving so many loopholes, or is the Russian growth an illusion? I think there's probably some things to be argued with it. Maybe it's not an illusion, but they're trading future growth at the same time. But then also the Western sanctions seem to be more show than substance. They're big, but they've left a lot of leeway for Russia to continue. And we'll go into that. So when the war started in February 2022, the Ukraine economy contracted by 30% due to the war. War damage to displacing of industry. So you have damage to everything, infrastructure, buildings. People can't work. They can't contribute to the economy. Loss of territory and the loss of population. So a large portion of the population left Ukraine. A lot of them can't work because their lives have been disrupted due to the war. Many people left at the front. Then there's also territory out in the Donbass and north of Crimea that is completely now not contributing at all to the Ukrainian economy. So that's why it contracted so heavily in that first year. In 2023, it did increase by 5.7%, which is actually faster than the G7 countries, and actually is faster than Russia. But this is a comp number. It improved 5.7% versus 2022, which was a 30% decline. So it's not like their economy has bounced back. And in 2024 and beyond, it is expected to grow at 4%. But remember, it is growing on a lower base because of the contraction of 2022. It will be into the 2030s before the economy in Ukraine reaches the 2021 levels. The war is absolutely wrecked the Ukrainian economy. I've written papers about, I think that about the war. I'm a big advocate that the war needs to end. I do say that Ukraine is the aggrieved country. There's no reason for Russia to invade at that time, but Russia and NATO and some U.S. decisions in going back to even before 2016, basically walked us into a war. And I think that we need to find a way to end this war. Willing to end the Palestinian war, it's got to end. We got to have peace talks, but nobody's talking peace in Ukraine, which has a lot more casualties than what you're seeing in Gaza. By almost, it's some of the numbers are hard to come by. Not like Russia or Ukraine publish their figures, but you're looking at something like the war in Ukraine is, of course, it's been running longer than the war in Gaza, but you're looking at something like it's been running about 3 times longer, just over 3 times longer. And you're looking at casualty rates that are 20 times higher than what you're seeing in Gaza. But everybody's pushing for ending the war in Gaza, but we're continuing to fund the war or continue to push the war, whether Russians pushing for a war, Ukrainians pushing for war. Nobody's pushing for peace. And outside of some minor countries, Switzerland is going to do some minor attempts, half-hearted efforts. Turkey's probably got the most realistic plan, but that's a sad. When Erdogan is your leader in proposing realistic peace terms, that tells you how sad the world has become. So anyway, got off subject there. So the Russian economy in 2022 did not contract, but its rate of growth did slow. And by the end of 2022, it only grew 0.6%. And this is primarily due to sanctions. Their economy was not disrupted by the war like it was in Ukraine. So obviously their economy is less affected. They didn't lose any territory. They have not taken any significant damage to their infrastructure. Their slowdown in their economy is all due to the sanctions from the West. So even though they did slow down the Russian economy, they did not do a contraction, and nothing like what you're seeing in Ukraine. In 2023, the Russian economy, again, still on a smaller increased base, did improve 3.5% versus 2022. And the growth is expected to continue through 2026. I've not been able to find projections of the increases. The West is continually looking for ways to ratchet the sanctions even harder. So they don't have any growth projections. But most analysts agree that in the West, so this is not Russian analysts or neutral analysts, this is in the West, so these are not favorable. They're saying Russia is in a position to continue the war for 3 more years. 2 at the very least. So they could fight this war all the way into all of this year, all of next year at the very minimum, and all the way into 2026. What happens after that? This is where they think that maybe Russia's selling off some of their future to keep up their growth rates. Wars are expensive. So one thing that's driving the increase in 2023 is what you would expect. Also 2022 as well, which probably kept their economy from going into a negative number with the sanctions, is war production. Military vehicles, rocket engines for those missiles, aircraft, and munitions. All those productions are up. So that's what you would expect. You got to replace the spent munitions. You got to replace vehicles that are destroyed, damaged, have to be repaired. You got to replace those missiles that have been fired off. This is surprising. Computers, electronics, and optics production is up despite the sanction on high technology items like chips, computer chips. So, makes you wonder, how are they getting this through the system with the sanctions? Oil and mining are down, but this is not due to the sanctions. Oil and mining are down, mainly oil, is due to OPEC Plus reducing petroleum output. There's OPEC and OPEC Plus. Russia is a member of OPEC Plus. They're not one of the founding nations, but they are a member of OPEC Plus. OPEC Plus went in there and basically increased, they decreased their output of petroleum products, which increased the price of oil. Remember the part above where they called Saudi Arabia a pariah nation, and then they also sanctioned Russia? Yeah, there's probably a lot of push in the OPEC nations to push that price up. So they reduced production. So this means that this helps the Russian economy because they are very much energy sales is a big part of their economy. So they were able to sell this oil at a higher price. So this actually helped the Russian economy. But wait. I thought we sanctioned oil. Wrong. So anyway, we'll come into that a little bit later. There is a number of theories for the Russian growth. Is the conversion to a war economy has allowed Russia to make quick gains in defense-related sectors. Remember, we talked about rocket engines and vehicles, munitions, and all that. I've even wrote a paper about the production of artillery shells and the artillery shell race with the West. So there is some quick gains to be made in these related sectors. The war has taken up a lot of the slack in the defense industry for quick gains. So adding a second shift or a third shift to war production, these are quick things that you can do in your current infrastructure of factory output. So they took up a lot of the slack. It's not like you could add a fourth shift without making bigger buildings or something like that, or improve your work or increase your workforce or become more automated. Because remember, the technology sectors are also sanctioned. So a lot of those initial boosts get us up to 3.5% growth in 2023 have probably already been used up. So maybe you can get more efficient, and maybe you squeeze out. I'm going to throw a number out here because again, we did grow the GDP by 3.5% in 2023 despite the sanctions. So let's say defense industry improved 5%. You're probably not going to, it's probably greater than that, but I'm just going to say 5%. You've already used up all the slack in the industry. So unless you do something to improve being an economist, your land, labor, and capital, unless you can improve in one of those areas, they cannot really gain a lot into that sector. They basically have used up their capacity increase. They are trying to try to create more capacity, but there are sanctions on a lot of those technology items to help them to get to that point. So it is unsure that Russia can increase their capacity in a material way with the sanctions going on. So the Western Economic cites also, Western Economic Analysis cites that many young Russians and educated Russians have left the country due to the war. Remember when the war started, there was a big to-do about Russian young people and parents sending their kids out of the country to keep them from being drafted. A lot of those were people of need. So these were so they obviously had people of means, not needs, people of means, so they were able to leave the country. These are educated people and young people. This is important to Russia because when you look at their population replacement rate, it is well below replacement rate. So losing all these young, productive people is probably going to have an impact to both future modernization and innovation in the Russian economy. Basically, it is speculated that Russia is trading future growth to support the current growth in the economy. So they're also saying about here is that the Russian economy is demodernizing. It is becoming more reliant on commodity-based economy, selling minerals, selling oil, not selling goods and services like manufactured goods or services to the world. So their economic growth is going back to they're selling more oil as a percent of the economy. Actually, they're selling less oil, but as a percent of the economy, you're going to see oil becoming a higher percent. That yes, all these people, young people, educated people, becoming a brain drain is a legitimate argument. But if the Russian economy is demodernizing, why is computers, electronics, and optics sectors of the economy growing? These are some of those high-tech sectors, not all of them, but this is a lot of your high-tech sectors. Why are these improving despite the sanctions and the argument that, hey, all the young people are leaving and you're demodernizing their economy, but a modern sector of the economy, which again is very closely tied to war production, is still increasing? This goes into the most likely culprit is that China is providing a backdoor way to Russia to get around the sanctions. I know North Korea is providing artillery shells and rockets and drones to the Russians, but you really need it for technology. North Korea ain't the place you go for technology, so somebody's providing. And the most likely culprit is China. China does not have to ship its goods through maritime efforts, just like North Korea. They can ship the stuff across the Russian land border and not have to worry about having to pass through shipping lanes and having their ships tracked and intercepted. So most likely, and I agree with this, China is suspected of providing a backdoor way for Russia to get around sanctions. This means that when I talked about how is Russia going to be able to do that land, labor, and capital, how are they going to be able to expand the capacity in their war sectors, including optics, electronics, and computers, if they've got all these sanctions against modern computer chips? Is the most likely means is that China is providing this equipment to allow them to actually expand the capacity, which will mean that maybe their economy might be able to even grow faster than expected, than that 4% projection rates. I'm sorry, that 4% was Ukraine. Unknown projection of increased growth. Maybe they're suspecting that they will actually be able to improve their capacity and continue to grow a war economy due to some of the support that China is providing. China is not providing weapons. They've been pretty clear about that. I think that would be a red line crossing over with any type of avoiding the ire of the West. The Chinese economy is not doing well. So they don't need another headwind. So they don't need a Russian headache from the West in support of Russians by providing weapons. But they're willing to push and bend and selling a lot of dual-use items. These are items that can be both used for civilian and military purposes, like computer chips. China is providing a way for Russia to get around sanctioned products. So, how is Russia paying for this? Because China's not doing this for free. Russia's providing them China oil, at a discount. So, okay, that's, it seems counterproductive, but I thought we sanctioned. No, well, the part of the sanctions against Russia is that there's price caps on their oil. They can only sell it at a certain price. So what Russia's doing is they're selling oil to India and China at a discount. So they are getting flush with cash from those countries. So they have money to buy these dual-use items from China to help get around sanctions. And the other thing, so I just brought that up, like they're still selling their number one commodity. They're at war. The West has sanctioned Russia to get them to stop the war, but they are still selling oil. And the West is allowing that. So they're allowed to sell the oil on the international market. They sell it, just what I said, India and China, which is China's, at least, I'm not sure about India. I don't think there's any indication India's helping except buying oil. Is China is buying up Russian oil at a discount, giving Russia ways around the sanctions that cannot be easily tracked, and getting cash from this oil sale. So, and remember about talk about the SPR? China is part of that SPR. China sold off part of the reserves, but where our SPR is down almost by half, this is going back to the other article, China's SPR is flush with oil. They are more than full because they're buying all this Russian oil at a discount. Smart move on their behalf, can't fault them. This just tells you the half-hearted nature of the international sanctions that are more inconvenience than anything else. We'll go a little more into that here in just a second. So Russia is not completely cut out of the market. They sell, or again, sell to India, sell to China. They actually even still sell to Europe. They found ways that there's refineries that are majority owned by Russian companies that can still, those Russian companies that operate in the West can still buy Russian oil and then turn around and flood it into the market, meaning it mixes, it's a fungible product, so you're not going to be able to tell the difference between Saudi oil and Russian oil. Oil is oil. So it's still being able to be sold in the West. Yes, there is a price cap. Russia probably cannot sell it as profitable margin as they do, but they are finding ways around it. And if push comes to shove, I would not be surprised if they're breaking the OPEC cap to be able to sell more oil to China and Russia, or China and India. So this means that Russia's number one exported product, that is the ballyhoo of the Western sanctions, Russia can still sell oil and fund its war. And it can use this product, this oil, to purchase the items to get around sanctions with the help of China. Now, Antony Blinken just left China this week. He was meeting with them. So he was actually going to talk to give his harsh talk to the Chinese leadership about helping them get around the sanctions. And there might actually be more sanctions placed against China. Not against China as the nation, but they might focus on particular individuals and companies that are suspected of selling sanctioned products to Russia. As a side note, there was an interesting problem that happened in Sweden and I think Finland, where a bunch of street lights had their insides removed, and it's suspected that Russian sympathizers or agents or people that were working for the Russians had pulled all these inside inner workings of these lights, which had computer chips, and sold them to the Russians. Interesting side note. Not sure if it's true. Would put it past them. Probably pretty smart. Espionage is something that the Russians have proven themselves to be very good at. So, kind of goes in there. So, Russia still has money. They still have money for the war. So, Western sanctions are half-hearted because they have not cut off the supply of oil coming from Russia. That's hard to do on a fungible product, but it is possible. Look at what we did to the Iranians. We almost brought them to their knees. And then they got sanction relief. Okay, so the Western sanctions are half-hearted because the West, U.S. is a little bit of a different situation because the U.S. could become energy independent. But the rest of the West is not energy independent and relies on Russian oil and gas, or at least Russian oil and gas being available on the market to keep that pipeline, remember when I talking about the SPR, keeping that supply pipeline full. The West can also, because they are suffering under inflation, they cannot afford a spiraling price in oil and gas when already domestic support is potentially weak inside the European Union. Less so than the U.S., but it is potentially weak. So if Europeans are having to pay, let's say the Western decides to go all out and remove try to reduce or eliminate Russian oil from the market, you might see oil go up to, well over $100 a barrel, probably even pushing 200 because of the disruptions. The West doesn't want that. They do not want to lose what that would do to their economies, what that would do to their populations. So they're not really taking the efforts to really push to bring Russia to their knees. So they're never really serious with these sanctions against Russia because they're still leaving their number one money producing item and still allowing them to sell it on the market. So that means they can fund the war, and at the same time we're funding the other side of the war, meaning the West. For good or whatever side you fall on, whether that's good or bad, the fact is we're allowing, through our sanctions, we're allowing Russia to support their war, and we're paying to support Ukraine's side of the war. What sense does this possibly make? Because the West has not taken energy seriously. And they are subject to the whims and the price rises for not being energy independent. Whether that means using nuclear, whether it means using coal, whether it finds some other sources of energy. They were never serious about this. What the West was counting on was that Putin will lose support internally and he would be removed and the war would be over. That's what they were counting on, that this half-hearted measures would work. And they didn't. And the West is now funding the war in Russia and allowing Russia to fund the war in Ukraine. Just a ridiculous situation. Anyway, so we'll go in here. The nuclear arms race in the Baltic. This is another fallout of the Ukraine war. So unintended consequences. The Ukraine war created this, again, talk about unintended consequences to the world order as Russia and its allies in the West and its allies are in this decision cycle described as, it's pronounced, I've heard OODA loop or OODA loop. I call it OODA loop, which means observe, orient, decide, act. So it's often used, it was created by an Air Force officer, or this has always existed, but it was basically written out as a formal description of the decision cycles that happen within militaries, but it actually applies to many, many things within life. So anyway, so I kind of brought that up as an example. So the current loop, loops just keep going round and round and round and round. So the current loop, if you had to sit there and say what's going on in this war in Ukraine, you can date it back to the Cold War. But in the near term, let's just start our loop at the start of the Russian invasion. And that's the new observation, observe, orient, decide, act. The new observation step is the West making a decision through the observe, orient, decide, and act. In a very short period, the West, after the invasion from the Russians, the West decided to provide handheld anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine to help them survive that first phase of the war. All the way fast forward to the point that France is discussing sending troops to Ukraine. I wrote a paper on that. Look it up on Substack. It would be greatly appreciated. So that's where we're at today. Those are just an observation of what some loops. So in between these steps, between us providing missiles and anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles to the Ukrainians, all the way to France talking about sending troops to Ukraine. In between, NATO has added Finland and Sweden as members who declared they joined NATO due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The adding of these two nations made the Baltic into a near NATO lake. You look at a map, there's really it's dominated by NATO countries now. There is two open sides where the Russians can operate, and that's through Kaliningrad and Leningrad. But for the most part, the NATO is the dominating power in the Baltic. So also, the Baltic region of NATO has a long common border with Russia now, mainly driven by the adding of Finland, who already had an existing border with Russia. Is all of a sudden this becomes the longest border, so this is the most likely flashpoint of a Russian-NATO conflict if it was ever to come. Both sides know this, so the focus on the Baltic between Russia and NATO has got us to the point that they're talking about nuclear rearmament in this region. So the Russian side of the nuclear armament triad is coming from, I call it triad because It's coming from Belarus, Kaliningrad, and near the Finnish border. So those are areas the Russians have talked about, taken action, or have hinted that action is coming regarding nuclear rearmament in the Baltic region. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, agreed to station Russian tactical weapons in his country in what he described as the threat from Poland. Now, Poland is a big advocate for supporting the Ukraine war. They've also an advocate of the dangers of the Baltic region from a Russian attack. Despite what Lukashenko says, because Lukashenko, he says a lot of things, and they tend to not be true. He's basically a puppet of Putin. He is highly reliant, his economy is highly reliant on Russia to help keep him in power, to keep his economy stable so that he can stay in power. So despite what he says is that they agreed to station Russian tactical nuclear weapons in his countries, it's not from Poland. The more likely reason is that Russian President Vladimir Putin and his allies have threatened nuclear war against the West, and the continued actions and escalations of the West. I say escalations by the West by adding ever more sophisticated weaponry to Ukraine, and so maybe some of it's Chicken Little, but initially he threatened nuclear war, or that this the continued escalations by the West could lead to a nuclear war. The deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus was to add weight to his threat, where it wasn't just about him just saying words. He actually took action. He moved nuclear weapons into Belarus, and that's confirmed with our intelligence, or Western intelligence has confirmed that. Belarus is also building facilities to support Russian Iskander nuclear-capable missiles to be stationed in its territory. Doesn't mean they're going to get Iskander missiles, doesn't mean they're going to get Iskander nuclear-tipped missiles, but they're building facilities to be able to support these missiles. These are mobile launchers, but obviously they have to have facilities to support having those missiles there and all the crews available. Russia has also agreed to upgrade Belarus's air force with new fighters capable of dropping nuclear weapons. So obviously there's actual concrete steps that Russia has taken in Belarus, which has moved nuclear weapons just that much closer to the NATO-Russian frontier in the Baltics. The other one is Kaliningrad, which is an enclave between Poland and Lithuania, and actually doesn't have a common border with Russia. So it has to agree to, it has an agreement to have product or have items moved by train through Lithuania. And again, it's very, it's subject to the Western sanctions. So it is what they send through that train, that rail link that goes from Russia to Belarus to Lithuania into Kaliningrad is heavily regulated or heavily monitored. But Kaliningrad also has a port on the Baltic Sea and can receive supplies coming from, so a lot of their weaponry will come from Leningrad, which is also a military district in the Baltic. Kaliningrad is the other military district in the Baltic. So Leningrad, I'm going back to my World War II. Leningrad, St. Petersburg is the same city. So St. Petersburg, that's what's called now, which is funny, that's where Putin came from, is St. Petersburg does have a common border with Russia. So items can come through Russia, get to Leningrad, put on ship, and go to Kaliningrad. So that's probably where you're going to see nuclear or any type of weaponry is going through that port connection, maritime connection with Leningrad. St. Petersburg, sorry. So Russia says they do not confirm or deny the use of or the presence of nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, but there are nuclear weapon storage sites in the enclave. And also, the last 2 years, there's been upgradings to these sites for nuclear weapon storage, which is about 30 miles or 50 kilometers from the Polish border. So they have existing storage sites for nuclear weapons, and they're upgrading those. So probably pretty strong indication that Russia probably has nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, whether they're airdropped or if they're on the Iskander missiles. That is still up for debate. The final region is that's Russia is announcing that it's going to be forming, which is again a nuclear threat, is Russia has announced through their media the formation of a new missile brigade in Karelia near the Finnish border. The brigade will also be armed with Iskander missiles, which again are nuclear capable, and the purpose of this brigade is response to Finland joining NATO. So there's three areas that it looks like Russia, or not looks like, Russia is taking concrete steps to follow through with their threats of, no, their threat is to start a nuclear war, but they are doing steps to make them in a better position to support a nuclear use of nuclear weapons. Not saying they will use them, that's a big Rubicon to cross, but if they actually have capability, then you're beyond words. You're actually talking about capability. So, in response, NATO has not really done a lot in this nuclear escalation from Russia. They grab their pearls and they say these are terrible things for Russia to be threatening, and Russia should not be threatening war to that. Well, Russia doesn't really mean it. All the way to French President Emmanuel Macron telling Russia over their one threat, I think last month, where they threatened nuclear war. France responded, Macron responded, well, we got nuclear weapons too, and we're willing and we're ready to use them. So he wasn't really deterred too much by the threat. He has interesting things with coming out of Emmanuel Macron. Also wrote about that. You can go to my Substack and read that as well. So now we're actually seeing some concrete steps happening this week, and some of the discussions have actually been occurring for since the beginning of this year. Is Andrzej Duda, the president of Poland, says that Poland is ready to host U.S. nuclear weapons on its territory in response to Russia. He said that the president stated that Poland would take them if NATO, and it's also almost like goading, if NATO decided on a policy of reinforcing its eastern flank. This wording indicates that Poland is pushing for the deployment of nuclear weapons to its territory in response to Russia's decision to move weapons into Belarus and probably Kaliningrad, both very close to Poland. Poland has also been a consistent critic of Russia and its potential threat in the region, even before the invasion of Ukraine. Poland, also prior to the invasion of Ukraine, was in a process of building up its armed forces with a goal of becoming the biggest European power as far as military goes. Poland is also requesting that its Air Force be trained and certified to deliver U.S. nuclear weapons. The U.S. currently only has, where Russia has tactical nuclear weapons with various delivery systems, including the Iskander missiles and drop bombs, because again, talking about Belarus wants to be able to deliver. The U.S. Delivered Russian nuclear weapons. The U.S. only has in Europe right now, I think in 4 locations, B-61 nuclear gravity bombs. And it does certify some allies to have what's called dual capable aircraft, or DCA, that can deliver both nuclear and conventional bombs. Poland has requested that its Air Force be trained by the U.S. to classify its aircraft as DCA. Now, right now, Poland does have some F-16s. F-16s, from my understanding, is not a certified aircraft for DCA, but Poland is receiving the F-35 Lightning II American-made F-35 Lightning II, and it has recently been certified as a DCA platform. And Poland is scheduled to get delivery of 32 F-35s starting in 2024. So it actually is an open area that Poland might be authorized and trained by the U.S. to deliver U.S. nuclear weapons. U.S. still maintains control, but they could use allies to deliver these weapons. So Poland has really willing to step up. They have taken threats from Russia. Poland seems undeterred by the Russian threats. But Russian threats are also ambiguous, so no real response. This does not mean that Poland is going to take nuclear weapons, but they are of the opinion that they can take them, and it's obviously been discussed with the U.S. So I think it has not been rejected out of hand. The U.S. doesn't usually make big announcements that they're moving nuclear weapons unless there's a purpose to make such announcements. So be interesting to see where this goes. So obviously moving nuclear weapons into the region is obviously a increase of the threat potential within the area. Decisions by NATO and Russia prior to the war have created this situation that we're in with the Ukraine war. Now I talk about that as both parties made missteps and basically walked themselves into the war that never need to occur. NATO, I'm generally a supporter of NATO, but NATO's expansion into the east, deep into the Russian border, was always been a red flag since World War II. You're talking about something that's Russian sacrosanct policy since 1945, about having a buffer zone between the West. So many things that both sides did, but we kind of walked into this. So once the war was initiated, the Ukraine war, the preceding OODA loop have led to the point that both Russia and NATO have upped the ante to not only threaten nuclear retaliation against each other, but to make the physical step possible to move nuclear weapons and capable systems closer to the Baltic region's frontier. It cannot be simply stated the world is walking into a new Cold War, because during the Cold War, you could say, okay, yeah, we're walking into another Cold War. Probably feels very much like that. But during the Cold War, there was never a land war on the European continent that destabilized the situation. And so obviously that's a hot war in Ukraine. Russia obviously is involved. We are not directly involved in that we're sending troops. We do have advisors, apparently. I think they're mainly various roles. I think the U.S. official position is we're just tracking weapon deliveries inside Ukraine. So we do have some personnel involved there. But for the most part, our role is sending weapons and money into Ukraine. But it's during a hot war. So a hot war has a more rapid action-reaction cycle in the OODA loop than a Cold War. So obviously a Cold War, you don't have troops pouring across the border and attacking out of Kaliningrad towards Warsaw, or so you don't have to worry, or towards Gdansk. Then all of a sudden you have to do something right then and there. Cold War, you have time. The Soviets move in SS-20 missiles into Central Europe. We have time to form up, meaning the U.S. has time to form up saying, yeah, we're going to send Pershing 2s and nuclear-armed cruise missiles to Europe. That had time to kind of flow through years. Well, in a hot war, you don't have years. You don't have months. You have days. You might have hours. You might have minutes to make decisions. So where you have time in a Cold War to make thoughtful, rational decisions, you don't have that in hot wars. And so even if you go in there and pre-plan, like, okay, during the Cold War, we're going to say this, 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 and this. Well, what's the saying is that, your greatest plans fall apart as soon as you make contact in a hot war. So you can prepare for it. Definitely helps prepare for it. But your decision cycle is much more increased in a hot war. So the OODA loop goes much more faster in those times. You have less time to observe. You have less time to make those decisions, less time to take action. You have less time to observe, less time to make that decision. There is a chance that there's a higher likelihood of making hasty, rash, mistaken decisions. So you have less time in a hot war, which means you have more time or less. You have more likelihood of creating a bad decision, a rash decision, a wrong decision. And so we're moving forces closer together, including nuclear forces in the Baltic, due to the fallout of the Ukraine war. That OODA loop where it just keeps changing and new things get added, adding missiles, all the way to the point of adding Sweden and Finland to NATO, Russia attacking the energy grids outside of the during the winter to make it harder on the Ukrainian population, which causes us to sell more anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine, which puts more threat to the Russian Air Force. So again, we go in this decision cycle. It goes on and on and on. So we've got to this point, and that's just through a slower decision cycle because the West is not directly affected. Yeah, the Ukrainians and the Russians are feeling it pretty fast, but we are not directly involved, so we have more time to set this out. We are moving more and more forces closer together, including nuclear forces, in a closer and closer to a land war that is ongoing. It is just it's just a risk to a war that can dramatically lead to a misstep with consequences that we haven't seen for the Cold War. Feels like we kind of blew what the Cold War, the win after the Cold, we'll call it the win after the Cold War. We kind of blew it. So, not saying it's gloom and doom, not saying that they can pull back, but when you start rushing, including nuclear forces, closer and closer together, and we're all sitting on close to the border where shootings actually happen. All it takes is a couple errant Russian missiles to land in Lithuania, Poland. They already have happened in Poland. And all of a sudden you walk yourself into a shooting war because the forces are there. So anyway, more to come on that, but continued moving of nuclear weapons into the Baltic region, just increasing your risk. Hopefully our leaders will find a way to keep from crossing over into a hot war. Okay, enough about that one. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for my non-subscribers who have read my articles. 1/3, it looks like my articles are read by people that are not subscribers. I had probably my best week on Substack last week, and I had some of the worst performance from my subscribers, which I'm thankful for. But my increase in readership last week, which was the best week I ever had, was due to non-members coming in and reading my articles. So I thank both my members and I thank my non-members for that. But to help me out, it would be greatly appreciated if you even sign up as an unpaid subscriber at Substack. That helps me out. Funny thing is, Substack is going to be my main area. I prefer to write, but I'm trying to get more outreach. So you've probably seen that Substack allows me to post videos now. So I do post videos on Substack. I post them on Rumble. I post them on YouTube. My audio files go to, including the videos actually turn into audio files and are also available on YouTube as audio files, Spotify, and Apple Podcast as audio files. So I'm on a lot of different areas. There's nothing that's going to be in YouTube or any of these other services that you will not find on Substack. Substack is still my main source, using of other areas of Other networks is just a way to get my word out, to get people to read my articles, where you get more of a detail and have time to actually read stuff that you normally can't get from videos. But it has been a big help having videos available on Substack now. I've been doing short form videos that are about 3 minutes apiece. I have added a service. I've posted one service that will allow me to do full size videos that are going to be 6 to 10 minutes long, and I can go up to 60 minutes long. They are AI videos. I just want to make this clear, is that I write the scripts for the AI those videos, and the AI services just provide the video and the picture content without me having to go through copyrighted information. So I just want to let everybody know I actually write those scripts for all the videos. So I released my first long form video just a few days ago. I will probably be releasing another one tomorrow, and I will be trying to release probably 3 longer forms. I've got to decide whether I'm going to continue to do the summary ones now that I can do long form. Still undecided about that. It's a little bit of extra work to do that. But they are fairly popular. I actually had one video, one of the short form videos on Balakatan 2024. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Exercise, and it had 2,200 visitors through the Substack release on YouTube, because when I place, because it goes through the RSS feed, and YouTube is a video service, they read it as that RSS feed is not an audio file, but also a video file. So I got 2,200 videos from the Substack RSS feed into YouTube, and 2,200 from the direct same video directly on YouTube. So a total of 4,400 views on a 3-minute video. Looks like I had a lot of support from the people in the Philippines. So again, I want to reach out, say thank you, and also as well as the other supporters. So I did get a lot of views on that one video. So I got to decide if I want to continue doing the video summaries. Probably not going to decide immediately. Probably going to give it a couple weeks to make that decision. But if you have any thoughts, just enter it in the comments on Substack. Again, I'd appreciate all the readers or all the subscribers. I actually have more subscribers on YouTube at 51, I think, compared to 18 on Substack. And I have over 500 on Rumble, which is surprising because Rumble is much smaller than YouTube. Much, much smaller. But it just tells you how much the algorithm in YouTube hurts me. That even though I did get those big numbers in that one Balakatan, I don't get a lot of big numbers on my videos on YouTube because I just can't get up there in their algorithm. So I went back and played some funny math because that's what I do, and roughly speaking, looking at the differential between Rumble and YouTube, if all things being equal for each viewer, I have an 835% better chance of having my video seen by a YouTuber, by somebody on Rumble than somebody on YouTube. But YouTube is just so much bigger that when it does hit, I get a lot of views on YouTube. But for the most part, when you go into the average views, I have more views on Rumble. So Rumble is definitely a much better area for creators. They probably treat everybody much better. I don't have the algorithm games on Rumble that I do on YouTube, but I can't get my word out just on Rumble because, again, the weight of YouTube, when I get some way around the algorithm like I did for Balakatan 2024, when it hits, it really hits. So just interesting that I get into those nerdy stuff. I wish Substack had better views of metrics, but they don't. YouTube and Rumble definitely do a much better job in providing you feedback on how your stuff is performing. So just a little bit of information how my channel is going. So if you want, if you like my work, again, please consider becoming a subscriber, whether paid or unpaid. Also supporting me on Patreon. That would be a big help, or becoming a paid supporter on Substack. I start getting more paid supporters on Substack. I will start doing exclusive content for Patreon supporters and Substack supporters that would not be available on the unpaid supporters. Because doing this AI videos to get my word out, signing up for more news services, that all costs money. The expense isn't great, but it does add up. So, again, even if you're an unpaid subscriber, both either whether on YouTube, Rumble, or preferably Substack, it helps me out regardless. So, please consider becoming a member or a subscriber. That would be great. Paid would be even better. And once I start seeing paid subscribers, even if there's just one of you out there on Patreon or Substack, I will find a way to provide exclusive content to those members. So anyway, this one went longer. I got a little bit longer winded. I could just love talking about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It hits all the things. It talks about military history, it talks about economics, all those nerdy things I really get into. So anyway, thank you for listening to the Substack Weekend in Review Unscripted podcast number 6. Thank you again for all your support, and I hope that you have a great week, and I will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.